Welcome everybody to the Liberal Party Defence and National Security Policy Branch for our webinar with Captain James Fanell, United States Navy retired. It is a great honour and indeed privilege to have my friend Jim on and speaking to us on a very important topic, just as the Australia, United Kingdom, United States trilateral security partnership has been signed just in the last few days. And very appreciative of Jim getting up early in the morning as he is in Switzerland. And as it's 5 p.m. here in Australia, which is nice and comfortable. I know it's a little bit earlier in Switzerland, so we appreciate, Jim, you taking the time to address our policy branch on this really very important topic that very much deserves bipartisan support in Australia. Jim has had a very long and distinguished career in the United States Navy. He's was head of intelligence for the United States Navy for the Pacific Fleet. So he's been essentially watching over this region of our world, the Indo-Pacific, for a very long time, and watching the rise of China and in particular the rise of Chinese capabilities, military capabilities, the PLA and the PLA Navy's capabilities. He's watched what they've done in the South China Sea with their 7 islands that they built and then said they wouldn't militarize, but have since militarized. He's very well of their aggression, and he knows what their capabilities are and what their intentions are, particularly for this part of the world, and Australia being one of the United States' key allies in this part of the world. So we very much, it's great to have Jim on here. In fact, if you were watching Channel 9 on Monday night on Liz Hayes, Jim and another friend of ours, Colonel Grant Nisham, featured on that Channel 9 show about 2 years ago. Jim was on 60 Minutes Australia with Liam Bartlett, where they went across a number of Pacific islands, including Kiribati, or Kiribati as they call it there, and Solomon Islands and other areas. So we are very fortunate to have an expert in this topic to be joining us today. He has a wonderful presentation to provide. We're really excited about it. And I would hand over to our secretary, James Kell, to provide a little bit more information about how the presentation is going. But just before I do that, I would say that I might drop off in about 10 minutes or so, perhaps 20 minutes, depending, as I may be going on to Sky News at around 5:30, and they may contact me a bit earlier than that. So if I drop off, then I'll leave you in the capable hands of James Kell. And welcome, Jim, and let me just hand over to James, and he can take it from there.
Okay, just before I hand over to Captain Fanell, one last time, if you have any questions, it's the Shapes button down the bottom, and create a question, ask that. Apart from that, I'm absolutely stoked that Captain Fanell is coming here to talk about such a critical topic today. Over to you, Captain Fanell. Thank you.
Well, thanks, James, and Lincoln, thank you very much. It's an honor for me to be invited to speak to you all at this time of this announcement of this new deal. And so I'm really honored to be asked to speak to you all, because it really deals with your national security. And so I'm going to provide you a series of slides basically broken into 2 parts. The first half is going to talk about what I perceive to be the threat, which is what I spent my career on, following the Chinese and the Chinese Navy in particular. And then I'll go through some of the basics about the U.S. Navy submarine force and some of the options that I think that you all may have going forward in this deal. The thesis basically is, you can read it on the screen, but my thesis is that China is coming for you. And it's irregardless of your relationship with the United States in many ways. China is on a grand strategy, and that strategy includes domination of the Indo-Pacific region, if not larger areas. And the picture that you see on the left, that's a picture from a Chinese frigate that was in Sydney Harbor in 2012. And one of your officers snapped a picture of this on the bulkhead. And what you see is a Chinese dragon coming out from the Chinese mainland with 3 vectors, one going up into the Sea of Japan, one out into the mid-Pacific, across the AUKUS, and then one down into the South China Sea. And that middle arrow is not just into the mid-Pacific, but it's also into the South Pacific, as the Chinese, since that picture was taken, and this predates Xi Jinping, by the way, is, China's kind of way they see that they're going to be breaking out and taking control. And this is something that's a long historic dream for the Chinese Communist Party. And we've only really kind of gotten a glimpse of it in the last 8 years since Xi's been in power, and he's labeled it the Great Rejuvenation or the Great China Dream. And the centerpiece of that export of that strategy, at least in the area that we're talking about today, is maritime power. And you can see what Xi said about maritime power back in 2013. And there's this debate, and I think one of your former prime ministers this last week continues to say that China is a land power, a continental power, and not a naval power. And that's simply a mischaracterization of where China is today. That may have been true historically for the last several hundred years or even millennia, but today China is a naval power, and we can talk a little bit about that. This is what China looked like in 2000 in terms of their military and their naval operations. They relatively had a very small coastal defense naval force. In the yellow there, you can see they never really went more than 30, 40 miles from their shores 20 years ago. And then 15 years later, we saw them not only increasing the purchase of and building of their fleets, but they also began to operate not only inside the first island chain, but outside the first island chain. In 2006, you had the incident where a Song submarine popped up behind the USS Kitty Hawk that was east of Okinawa. And then a year later, you had the first Chinese surface action group go out into the mid-Pacific there in the Philippine Sea. And since that time, 15 years ago now, or about 15 years ago now, China has just continued to ramp that up. And their spending has also increased. And by this time, we've seen China operating literally throughout the Indo-Pacific, if not, into the Mediterranean and the Baltic and other places. But on a routine basis, China is operating in these waters, while U.S. presence and I would say allied presence, Australia and our other allies, have relatively stayed the same and haven't grown. This chart shows just a visual of ship production, surface combatants, and you'll see starting around 1999, you start to see that orange from China starting to pop up, and then before Xi came to power in 2013, you start to see that growth. The growth of the Chinese Navy really began under Jiang Zemin and continued under Hu Jintao, and then has exponentially grown under Xi Jinping. I've written about this and published some charts. This is an estimate that it was published in the Navy War College Review this last year, and you can see that this estimated size of the Chinese submarine force by 2030 could be over 100 boats. It's somewhere between 62, 68 boats today. I included this slide just to remind you all that you already know this, but just to point out the fact that China has been operating submarines in the Indian Ocean off your west coast in essence since 2013. And this was, the first one that got publicized. It was a Shang-class nuclear submarine. And a lot of people discounted it and said the Shangs are noisy and we don't have anything to worry about. But again, that was, 8 years ago. And, the Chinese press and the U.S. press hasn't talked a lot about Chinese submarine operations. And that doesn't mean that they haven't continued. And so a lot of the time we need to remember that just because something isn't in the newspaper doesn't mean that the Chinese have stopped. And from all the information I have from my sources, Chinese submarine operations have continued to expand over this last decade. This is a slide some of you may have seen and may know about, but Chinese oceanographic research ships operating north of Papua New Guinea. These kind of operations and these kind of surveys are precursors to future submarine operations. So if I go back and I show you this slide from the Indian Ocean from 2013, you can I could show you graphics from a decade prior to that in the late 90s, early 2000s, where Chinese oceanographic research vessels were surveying the waters of the Indian Ocean, and then submarines followed. And it's the same thing here. And Australia has some very critical communications cables. These are of interest to any adversary, especially the Chinese. So I just throw these out as ideas or thoughts of why the waters around Australia would be important for China in the event of a conflict, and why a submarine force for the PRC would be interested in these, and why therefore Australia should be interested in having a submarine force. As an American, as somebody that operated in the Pacific Fleet my whole career, one of the things we always talk about from our perspective is this idea of the tyranny of distance. And so the majority of our fleets are on the west coast of the United States in San Diego and up the coast. And it takes quite a while to get from the west coast into the fight, if you will, into the Western Pacific. Whereas when I look at this graphic, and you all can see it, you know, you are in the region. Even though you're below the equator, you're still much closer to the fight. And that's why this deal is so important from an American perspective, which is to say we have facilities, if you will, not they're your facilities, but we have access geographically to be able to spread the fight out for China, make it harder for them, but also to be there closer to the theater than we are from the west coast of the United States. And China's presented the United States and the rest of us with some very tough challenges. This is a graphic from about 7-8 years ago from a Chinese naval and merchant ship magazine showing their array of surface defense and air defense and fighter bases that would be able to operate from those three major naval bases that they constructed in the South China Sea: Mischief Reef, Subi Reef, and Fiery Cross Reef. And you can just see in the bottom half of that graphic, you know, their envisioned plan of striking a U.S. aircraft carrier or anybody's surface combatant, major surface combatant, using shore-based anti-ship cruise missiles, sea-based, submarine-based, and aircraft. And so it's hard for us to, in our military planning, we have this, the Chinese have called it counter-intervention strategy. We term it A2AD, anti-access area denial, and that's exactly what China's done in the first island chain. You may recall last year, China shot a DF-21 and a DF-26 into that target area just southeast of Hainan Island. Again, another demonstration of their counter-intervention strategy to be able to force U.S. aircraft carriers and other aircraft carriers and large deck ships out of the first island chain and out of the South China Sea. And you may not have seen this, but this is a Google Earth image from 2012. On the right, on the left is Yokosuka Navy Base, where our aircraft carrier, forward deployed aircraft carrier, is located. On the right is an image from 2012 on Google Earth, which shows the same outline of Yokosuka Navy Base out in Western China. And that's now been bulldozed over, and you can't see that anymore. But the message is that China, in the event of executing their mission, taking Taiwan or taking possession of these islands that they think are theirs, the disputed territories, they're going to strike American bases. So with their strategic rocket force. So this is another planning consideration for the United States, which is we're being forced out in some sense because of this strategy that China has embarked upon over the last decade and a half. So let me just go back one second and just foot stomp. So the real threat is that China has built a military force that's designed to keep the United States out of the fight and be able to take our conventional protection against our allies that we've had for 70, 80 years in the Pacific and drive it out. And so it limits, in a way, the ability of the United States to be able to get into the fight if we're coming from the West Coast or coming from Guam. And it impacts those forces that are forward deployed, which, as I mentioned, haven't fundamentally changed our force posture in the Western Pacific over the last 30 years, while China's has dramatically increased. So what's that mean for this deal? And I know a lot of you are interested in what the U.S. submarine force consists of. And so right now we have a force of 68 submarines today in the U.S. Navy. The long-term ship planning goal is to have a force of 66 submarines. That's been the standard over the last at least the last decade or so. And there was anticipation that we would go below that because of the service life. And I'll get into a little bit of that a bit later. We have 20,000 active duty and reserve submariners, submarine personnel that are available to the force today. So I kind of, to put that in perspective about what this would mean for Australia in terms of a force size comparatively. We have 4 classes of submarines. We have the Ohio class SSBN. 14 of those, 4 were converted several years ago into guided missile submarines, which can launch Tomahawks. And we have 4 of those. We have the Los Angeles class 688, 688I class. There's 28 of those currently on active duty. And that class is being phased out. At the end of the Cold War, we built 3 Seawolf classes that were going to be used to continue the deterrence operations against the Soviet Navy. And when the wall came down, this class was ended. And we actually have 2 of those, and one is a third one is for other purposes. And then finally, we have the Virginia class, and we actually have today 19 of those on track, and that's the class that's the one we will use going forward. And of those, these kind of fast attack submarines that are basically built to destroy enemy navies, that comprises 73 of our entire submarine force. And you can see those 3 classes there. But I put this slide up just to reinforce the reason we have these submarines is to destroy other navies. And they do a lot of other things, but that's the purpose of having these kind of submarines, the main purpose of why our nation spends millions and billions on them. As I said, there's other missions. You have strike, you have deterrence, anti-submarine warfare, special operations, intelligence and surveillance and reconnaissance, drug ops and mine warfare. But the one on the bottom left, anti-surface warfare, is the one that I think is the most important today in terms of dealing with the challenge from the PRC Navy. Just a little bit about the Virginia payload module on the Virginia class submarine. You can see there it has 12 tubes that are, amidship and that are vertically launched. And they also have 4 torpedo tubes forward. And what's important is that you have a dramatic increase in the number of kind of missiles that you can launch. For instance, 40 Tomahawks or tactical missile systems. There's also this discussion of this new global prompt strike with the prompt strike weapon, which is basically this expected hypersonic missile. We'll have 8 to 12 that'll be able to be on board the Virginia class, which will give us an added capability as those Ohio class go down and are replaced by the follow-on SSBN. And those SSGNs, those 4 that we have, when their service life goes away, they have like a 40-plus year service life. Those 4 SSGNs, when those go away, there's going to be a dip expected. There was expected to be a dip in the number of Tomahawk-like land attack missiles that we could shoot. And by improving the Virginia-class payload, it now bumps that back up and allows us to sustain that kind of force posture and ability to project power with these kind of weapons. And oh, by the way, we have a new version of the Tomahawk that's been adapted to go after surface ships. And I think that's a good step forward, much needed. And so these Virginia class will be able to use those 12 missile tubes to be able to strike Chinese surface combatants in a very serious way. I mentioned there's 2 new programs coming on. We talked about the Virginia. That's actually not new anymore, but it's the Block 5s are now in production. And then the Columbia, which will be the new follow-on to the Ohio class SSBNs. The Columbia class and the replacement program, I just put that up there not because I know Australia's not going to have ballistic missile submarines, but I put it up there just to highlight 2 areas on the slide. One is that green block that talks about Navy reactors and the service life and reactor cores, and just the issue of Navy reactors I'm going to talk about a little bit later, but I wanted you to hear that term Navy reactors and understand what it means, which is an enterprise of nuclear activity. And then you'll also see that we have a common missile compartment with the UK in our ballistic missile submarines. So it gets to this idea that we're partnering with the UK in this area, which gets to this, how do we all partner together under this new agreement? The Los Angeles class, I mentioned there's 28 of those currently today. And I know that there's a lot of talk already in Australia about, well, maybe we could lease some, of the decommissioned LA class submarines. And what you'll see here is these are the 28 submarines. And over the course of the next 5 years, the U.S. will decommission 11 LA class submarines as we replace those with Virginia class. Excuse me. And you can see the numbers. It'll be 2 in 22, 4 in 2024, 2 decommissioned in 2025, and then 3 in 2026. And so it would appear that there would be a lot of potential there for that. And I would just say that my consultations with folks back in Washington in preparations for this and some retired submarine officers that I worked for over the years, the problem is the service life of these submarines. The reason the United States is decommissioning them is because they've reached the extent of their service life. And so now, as a class, we had anticipated that the service life of these submarines, these LA class submarines, would be over 30 years. And we had anticipated 5 years ago when I retired, there was an expectation that in the decade from 2020 to 2030, there would be a bathtub in availability of fast attack submarines. And that was based upon this service life as a class, the LA class, which was, again, I think it was like 32, 33 years. Now, a couple of years ago, or a year or two ago, the Navy decided to look at each individual submarine on a case-by-case basis and judge its service life based upon its actual utilization rate and how many days at sea it had and how many turns the propulsion system had. And this was now allowed us to keep and retain more of the LA class submarines. So somewhere between what you're seeing on this graphic and over the course of the next 5 or 6 years, there could be some submarines that maybe are available, but this is something that your Navy and our Navy are going to have to talk about. But what I would say is this idea that you could just take the first, starting in 2024, take 4 of those boats, the Chicago, the Key West, the San Juan, and the Topeka, and just have them come over and be leased by the Australian Navy. It may not be that simple because those submarines, their service life has expired, and you would be taking a submarine that we wouldn't be willing to give because it wouldn't be safe, because its plant and everything else is it's just not safe. And so this is the balance that would have to be discussed between our navies and the experts that would be involved with this. But it is an option. So this is the kind of my short list plan of what I think the Australian Navy needs to do. And I'll spend a little bit of time on this slide. I think you can break down your challenge into 3 areas. What you can do right now today before the plan that I know was announced that said you had 18 months to come up with a plan, but I think we don't have 18 months to write a plan. And so I think there's things that Australia can do right now on its own that can get things and get the ball rolling. I think the first one is to ask the United States to be able to send a team of Australian experts from your defense industry, certainly from your Navy, out to Yokosuka and Guam, where we have nuclear facilities there, so that your people can get an observation of what it's required to be able to pull a nuclear boat pierside, be able to service it, maintain it, operate from a base like that. We built this one in Yokosuka while I was in the Navy, as we prepared for the replacement of the first convention, or the last conventional submarine or aircraft carrier to the first nuclear aircraft carrier, the George Washington. And I watched as they transformed Yokosuka Navy Base. Wasn't a massive amount of effort, but it did take some time and it takes some expertise. And I think Australia would be well to have a team go right now in this year, if they can, and take a look and start looking at what these things are and how, and getting a sense of what you would all have to do in Australia. I would also recommend, given what we said about this lease problem, is to offer up home porting U.S. Navy submarines in Australia. I know that there's already talk about British submarines doing the same thing. I think that's fine. But the idea that the Australian people see nuclear submarines, and oh, by the way, U.S. Navy nuclear submarines have made port calls in Australia. You all know that. What I'm talking about is something a little bit more a rotational process, if you will, like we talk about in certain other areas of the Pacific, where our ships, boats could operate from on a more extended basis. So they could operate and then you could also in that process start the development of a rider program. So we can get Royal Australian Navy ship riders that have got some levels of basic training that could get on board those ships with our sailors and start to expand your training program. And so that's this kind of ship rider lease program could be worked in conjunction. You'll see that I put Japan on the graphic. I've got another slide on Japan, but I think there's an option there as well, and we can talk about that a little bit later. In the midterm, in the next 1 to 3 years, I think you really got to start moving out to build this nuclear facility. You need to have a port. You need to have a place where you're going to construct and finally put together your submarines. In Adelaide, as I've been told, and maintenance facilities. And so these facilities need to be started to be built rather rapidly because this is going to be one of the long poles in the tent in terms of being able to operate your own facilities later on. You're going to need to have a recruiting and training program. I was on the 7th Fleet staff from 2008 to 2010, and my boss was Vice Admiral John Byrd, a submarine officer, and very close with him and still am today. And I remember when we would do staff talks with you all, we were told that you had 6 Collins class boats, but you only had enough personnel to man and equip and operate 2 of them. That was in 2008, 2010. And so this is, I think, one of the key areas that you all know about, but it's really important. If you're going to take on a nuclear submarine force, you're going to have to do something differently to recruit and train nuclear sailors. And it's something that you're all going to have to get your hands around. We can help with that. I think having U.S. submarines or British nuclear submarines in your ports now on a more routine basis, inviting people to come and look at them, having open houses, if you will, having interactions with the community to see how nuclear submarines are, see how safe they are, see how exciting a career in this field would be to attract young folks, I think is something that's got to be really analyzed and looked at nationally. Otherwise, this will not work. And then you can start deploying, once you get those sailors trained, some of this first cadre, which some of them that you may have already in your Navy should go back to schools in the United States and then come back and be able to operate either on a shipwrighter program or on these leased boats. These are things that can be done rapidly. The training doesn't take, some of the training would take longer, but you could get sailors trained up here in the next couple of years and be able to get them at sea and really start to build up that cadre of nuclear submarine personnel. And then obviously the long-term goal is you want to have your own nuclear submarines and operational. When would that be? Well, somewhere in the next 5 to 20 years, I would say. I don't think it's even 5. It's way too early. So I think, initially people were talking 2030. So that's just 9 years from now to be able to go from 0 to having your own program and your own ships deployed. And I think that's a little bit of a stretch. 2040 is probably more accurate. And I skipped over that second last bullet. You need to have your own Navy reactors network. You need to have something inside of Australia that can match up with the US and the UK system so that we're all working under the same system of safety and guidance. And that's really, really important. Nuclear submarines are not diesel submarines. They're not like conventional surface ships. This is a whole different ballgame, and it requires a whole nother layer of infrastructure that is specifically designed for safety and protection and zero defect in the way you operate at sea. And that's what I want to get across. The senior officer that I know very well, I asked him for some comments, and he basically said, you have to be able to establish Australia's own nuclear reactor enterprise. And it's going to entail things like training, schools, infrastructure, logistics, all kinds of things. And I'll go into that a little bit more. Navy reactors, there's one slide from a Navy reactors briefing that I have. And you can see we have 96 reactors operating worldwide. We have lots and lots of people and organizations around the country. We operate facilities that deal with nuclear power and nuclear fuel. And that whole process is very, very complex. It's been built up over the last 50 years since nuclear reactors has been in place. And it's something that, no one's saying, I don't think anybody in the U.S. is saying, well, Australia has to have something exactly like this. That's not the suggestion. But the suggestion is that there is a system that's in place in the United States and the UK, and Australia needs to have their own system. And so you need to understand the American system and then make it scalable to what your needs are. And one of the things is safety and defense in depth. I just mentioned this. What is defense in depth? You can read this, but I'll just kind of quickly say it. Defense in depth is needed because of the significant consequences of the loss of a ship or a reactor accident and insufficient assurance that any one inherent characteristic or plant system is enough to prevent those consequences. I'll let you read the rest. But this idea of multiple layers of defense to make sure there's never, ever an incident at sea or at shore with our nuclear submarines or nuclear ships. That is the hallmark of this nuclear reactor enterprise and this kind of thinking that has to be adopted inside the Australian mindset. And I don't mean to be preachy about it, but I'm telling you, I spent 30 years in the Navy, 29, and I worked around aviators. I spent many years on aircraft carriers. I worked around surface warfare officers, and I worked for 2 senior Navy submarine officers, and I spent a lot of time providing intelligence support to the submarine force over 30 years. And the submarine community, the nuclear submarine community inside the U.S. Navy is almost like a separate service because they're so attentive to this idea of defense in depth and fail-safe designs and things of that nature. So in this graph, you can see you have a threat or a hazard explosion or something, and then you can see these layers of defense in depth, redundancy in the hardware and software, self-regulation, large margins of error, long response time, operator backup, and then fail-safe design systems, all designed to prevent that event from actually having an adverse impact. And the result of that kind of thinking is this picture right here. Some of you may remember the unfortunate accident that occurred in 2005 when the USS San Francisco essentially ran into a seamount when it was underwater, 500 feet underwater, and it was going at over 30 knots, which is 40 miles an hour. So imagine being in a car going 40 miles an hour and hitting a mountain or hitting something solid. And we know how cars are built today. We know what would happen. The airbags would explode and the engine would be destroyed. The car would be totaled if you're going that fast. But here's a nuclear submarine that only had external damage and the pressure hull was not breached. Unfortunately, one sailor was not strapped in and was killed when it hit his head. But the damage from this didn't occur. And part of that is a reflection of this mindset that started with Admiral Hyman Rickover and when nuclear Navy began in the U.S. And so this idea of zero defect helps in the worst case scenario. And so I just want to foot stomp. This is a really huge part of taking on a nuclear submarine force. Can talk about the Astute class. I know that the Astute program is, I think there's planned 7 boats. There's 4 active right now. It's 97 meters in length. The Virginia class is 115 meters in length. So I can imagine there'll be some folks in Australia that may argue, well, this is smaller. It'll cost less. So maybe this is what we should go with. And I don't really have a position on that, except to say, if you weren't happy with a French design from a European nation that doesn't really operate that often out here in the Pacific, it seems to me from a operational sense that having boats that are built by America in conjunction with Australia, working together in the same place where American Navy is operating on a daily basis with numbers and scores of submarines would seem to be a better option. I'll leave it at that. You have to consider the Quad and how this fits into that. And that's part of this as well. And so I talk lastly about this Japanese option. There's a gentleman from our Congressional Research Service, Ron O'Rourke, who said and he examines this issue of how can we get more submarines into the Pacific from what we have right today. And his thesis is that Japan has an untapped resource. You'll see that the Japanese have 22 boats today. But if they were to extend the service life of their boats from 22 to 30 years, which is the physical service life of a Japanese submarine, they're so well made and maintained. But Japan has artificially made the service life 22 years, and that keeps them producing one boat. They produce one boat a year, and they always have 22 boats. But if they were to say, no, our service life is extended to 30 years, then there would be 8 extra boats available in this decade that Japan could, or that Australia could actually use today to get into the fight and to be able to fill that gap until you come up with your own solution. And the last bullet there talks about Japan's done this before. They used to have a force of 16 boats, and they said their service life was 16 years. And they built one a year, and they decommissioned one a year. And then about, I don't know, it was several years ago, they decided to bump it to 22. So I think we should be asking Japan, why don't you bump this to 30? And then let's see how we could use those boats as a gap filler for Australia until this nuclear plan and program are fully developed and integrated with the US and the UK. And then lastly, I'll just say, you know, France is in the region. And I just saw on BBC a couple hours ago that Macron and Biden have talked. And we can talk about the decision and how this plan came out. But the idea of somehow not alienating the French, I think, is something worth talking about. It has nothing to do with the submarine, where you go in your future per se. But I think there's an issue here that needs to be addressed as part of this program. We need everybody on the same team, and China wants to divide us and conquer us. Finally, second to last slide. Some of you may have read this, maybe not, but I have my thesis I've been talking about for about a decade is this idea that the Chinese Communist Party has been on a strategy to achieve this great rejuvenation. Xi called it the Great Rejuvenation, but it was in the Chinese Communist Party ideology before Xi. With who? With Jiang Zemin. Deng had it, Mao had it. But Deng said we have to hide our time and bide our weakness, or bide our time and hide our weaknesses and lay low. And Xi now believes I don't have to do that anymore because I got the second largest economy in the world that's going to be the largest. I have the largest navy in the world. I have the large military. And it's time for us to come out and announce we're going to be the new global power. And they're going to celebrate that on 1 October 2049. And they're going to have, whoever that person is going to stand up in front of the Forbidden City and say, I am the leader of the People's Republic of China, and we have been restored to our rightful place in the world. And not only from a psychological standpoint, they've been restored, and on an economic standpoint, but that they have also been territorially restored. And they want, you know, Taiwan, they want the Senkakus, they want the South China Sea, they've got border disputes with India, they even have issues with Russia. But at least those first that I mentioned, Taiwan, Japan, South China Sea, and India, China has basically said that's our territory and we want it. And they would prefer to use non-kinetic methods to get that territory, like they did at Scarborough Shoal in 2012. So we know for a fact that Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping ordered the PLA to have the capability to take Taiwan, which is if you can take Taiwan militarily, these others are lesser included. He ordered them by 2020 to have that capability. And I believe the PLA and the Chinese Communist Party believe that they have the capability militarily to take Taiwan by 2020. So the question is, how late would the Chinese be willing to use military force and still expect the world to come to Beijing on 1 October 2049? And it makes no sense to think that China would launch an invasion of Taiwan in 2045 and then expect everyone to show up in Beijing 3 or 4 years later. So I think there's a debate inside the Chinese Communist Party about how late could they use military force and still expect the world to come to their event? And the example I think they're using is the difference in the time between Tiananmen Square, when the world condemned China for being barbaric, and then having everybody show up to the Beijing Olympics. And if you recall the opening ceremony of the Olympics in August 8th, 2008, it was 37, 38 degrees Celsius, 95% humidity. There was 80,000 people in the Bird's Nest Stadium. And if you remember that ceremony with the drums, it was fantastic. And above the top of the stadium, you had an air-conditioned skybox. And in it was Hu Jintao and the other members of the standing committee, and they were all in their Mao suits looking cool, calm, and collected. And what did they see when they looked down on that mass of people? Well, one person they saw was a guy who had his jacket off, his tie off, he had sweat stains under his armpit. And that guy was the leader of the free world, George W. Bush. And so what was the message that the Chinese Communist Party learned? They learned that within the space of 20 years, the US and the rest of the world forgot about what they did at Tiananmen and came and wanted to be at their opening ceremony. And so I think the Chinese Communist Party figures that if they back up 20 years from 2049 to about 2030, that's probably around the latest that they could use military force. So what I'm saying, and my thesis is that we are right now in what I call the decade of concern, which is sometime in this decade, if Taiwan is not resolved in the way they want, if the Senkakus are not resolved, if the Indian border is not resolved, China will use military force to take these things, because they know that if they wait past that timeline, it messes up their strategic plan. And so our goal is to make them go back to the drawing board and reassess. And then just a proof that, yeah, U.S. Navy submarines do pull into HMAS Sterling out on your west coast. So with that, I think I'll finish, and happy to take some questions.
Thank you very much, Captain Fanell. An amazing presentation. This next decade will present to us many difficult decisions that need to be made. And we're wedded to the US, and we have been for the last 70 years. And we need to, and we need to have independent capability. We can't put our heads in the sand. We must deny the CCP the opportunity to control the waters around Australia, and submarines are the best denial machines available, and nuclear subs are the best subs available. They're faster, they have longer crews, and they can stay under a lot longer. Captain Fanell's just taken us on a tour of the situation that is absolutely critical at the moment. I'm now going to ask if our own Chris Skinner, who's just published the Nuclear Propulsion Roadmap to Australia, can ask the first question of Captain Fanell. Thank you, Chris. If you could unmute and go for it.
Thanks, James, and Captain Fanell. In the Australian Financial Review today is an article. Says lease on subs unlikely, says former Navy chief, and it's quoting Mr. Richard Spencer, who was the US Secretary of the Navy until 2 or 3 years ago. And he rehearsed some of the things that you also mentioned about the end of life, and how the timing on the Virginia program is under some pressure and therefore would not be available, and the end of life on the Los Angeles class, although you did qualify that, saying that each submarine is being looked at individually. Surely, and I'd ask you to comment, the long pole in the tent, as they say, the thing that will hold us back most will not be the availability of the boats themselves. It won't be cost. It will be finding people and training them and qualifying them to meet the standards that we insist that they meet. What do you think about that?
Chris, I agree a lot. I hadn't seen former SecNav Spencer's comments. I think there's, as you said, there's boats, there's a way that we can make that work from a technological standpoint. And as we review each LA class individually, there may be an option for one or two. You don't have to have 8 immediately. So is there 1 or 2 boats that the U.S. is willing to extend that service life based on, sound technical analysis? That's, I think, as you said, that's not the issue. The real issue is, can Australia find the people to be able to man it and find those people and then train them and then qualify them. And I'm glad that you used the word qualify, because training is just one thing. Qualification means that you actually go out and are observed, and your performance is evaluated and you meet the high standards. And so that's really the real challenge. Some of that can be done by, I mean, I hate to say this, but there's probably a lot of retired Navy, U.S. Navy nuclear submarine folks that would love to come down to Australia and help bridge that gap. I mean, so there's an option there to be able to recruit some folks that are former nuclear submarine officers and sailors, and help them come along and bring people alongside.
We do have a precedent for that, in that when we re-established our submarine force back in the 60s last century, we were starting from a very low level of trained, qualified people, and the boats that we introduced were from Britain, and we persuaded a lot of UK people to transfer, and to either transfer permanently or to come out on a sort of a single secondment of 2 or 3 years or whatever basis. So hopefully we'd be able to do the same sort of thing.
Yeah, I've met some
James
of them.
Kell, I was going to hand back to you, James Kell, and leave you to look at other questions.
No worries. Thank you, Chris. I've got a question here from Robert Gilton, and just your take, Captain Fanell, on should Taiwan be taken by force? What are the associated impacts and knock-on effects?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. I mean,
Million-dollar question.
Yeah, I mean, and there's a lot there, but obviously, if Taiwan were to fall, it dramatically alters the military balance of power, which has, oh, by the way, been dramatically altered over the last 20 years with Chinese military buildup. We hear a lot of folks that are what I call the appeasement crowd, the engagement crowd, always refer to the status quo. We have to maintain the status quo, and so therefore can't give anything to Taiwan because that would upset the status quo. But the reality is the status quo has been dramatically altered over 20 years of PRC military modernization. So if the next step would be, if they were to take that island, what does that do with the PLA and the PLA Navy and the Strategic Rocket Force now forward operating from this stationary large island aircraft carrier now that can affect and really control who gets in and out of the south or the first island chain. And people say, well, who cares about that? Well, every year $5 trillion worth of goods and services go through the South China Sea. And if China is able to have 3 major naval bases the size of Pearl Harbor in the Spratlys, and have Taiwan and Hainan Island, I mean, it makes it almost virtually impossible for anybody to operate in the South China Sea that China doesn't want to have operate there. And sure, that's against military, but we also know that the Chinese have published and are discussing and have plans for commercial ships to be able to stop and say, who are you? I don't see your beacon. You're from a company in Australia that's selling this or that, or no, you can't come in. You're out. Get out, and drive you out or force you into a penalty box. So this is the kind of power that China would have, just in a kind of a very benign way to look at it. In a very aggressive way, it threatens Japan, and it threatens Japan's southern flank. And if Japan falls, then all of Asia is now under the domination of the Chinese military. And some people may say that's a good thing, and fine, you can live like that, but I don't want to live under that kind of a regime. And I don't think anybody else does either.
Thank you. Question here from Warwick Smith. Is there anything you can say about the Indian Navy submarine fleet, or the Indian Navy, their projecting forward, what their intentions are, their capabilities are, anything there, Captain Fanell?
I have great respect for my Indian counterparts. They're good friends in many ways in the Navy. They've got as you all know, a history of non-alignment. So there's strong elements in India that want to keep them non-aligned. But over the last, certainly the last half decade, India has woken up over the threat of China. This murder of their soldiers on the border at the line of actual control last year really transformed India. So I do a lot of speaking on Indian television that I never did in my career. I never was approached. So in the last year, since June of 2020, the Indians have really said, okay, we get it. So now, how does that apply to their Navy? Well, they have historically problems with their Navy and their submarine force in particular. So you know that they're leasing another Russian nuclear submarine. They've been leasing them over the last 20 plus years. I think they've leased originally two Charlie class SSNs. They've built their own ballistic missile submarine that is alleged to have it has nuclear plant, the Ariane. But I'm not sure in terms of their nuclear program. I'd say it's very, very nascent. It's very dependent upon Russia at this point. They've reached out to the United States. I think we could do a lot more to wean them off of reliance upon Russia and get over into the U.S. I don't want to say part of this trilateral submarine agreement, but this idea that we would have more in common with them. Sub-safety, sub-rescue was their biggest concern initially. I remember conferences and meetings with them in Delhi where they were very, very worried about submarine safety, and they knew the U.S. had, submarine rescue and safety procedures that they wanted to be learning about so they could save their people. And as you know, they've had a couple of submarines sink pierside, and it's kind of been an embarrassment to the Indian Navy. I don't see them projecting power, at least for another decade, with submarine force. They have submarines, they use them, they protect their waters. They're very focused, obviously, on Pakistan. So I think, and they're worried about the Chinese Navy and the PLA Navy submarine force operating in the Indian Ocean. But I think they're more interested in the ISR aspect of being able to find those Chinese submarines and to be able to prosecute them with maritime patrol and reconnaissance, which they have, that can operate from their land bases and be able to put Chinese submarines at risk, versus having a massive Indian submarine force that's going to go one-on-one with the Chinese submarine force. At least that's my take right now.
Understood. Thank you, Captain Fanell. I'm going to hand it over to our chairman, Lincoln, who's back on. He's just come back and joined us. So, Lincoln, are you happy to summarize, ask a final question? Yeah. How did it go?
Yeah. Thank you very much, James. I was on Sky with Chris Smith, who is filling in for Chris Kenny's spot. Jim Fanell knows Chris Kenny very well. He was on his show just a few days ago, and I was discussing some of the things we're talking about tonight with regard to the Labor Party really taking an each-way bet on this AUKUS deal, and what could that mean for Australia? I mean, will they cancel the part of the AUKUS deal that includes nuclear propulsion? And that's something we're getting very mixed messages from Labor Party politicians today, and that's pretty much what I was talking about just then. So unfortunately, I missed most of Jim's presentation. However,
which I went too long. I went about 40 minutes, so I'm happy to take more questions if folks want to ask them. I'm not rushed out.
Well, I appreciate that. I think we'll probably end it here, as I know that some people, including me, have other things that are coming on, and children that have been told to remain quiet for quite a long time, and dinner being cooked. So you should probably go get some breakfast. But it's really been our absolute privilege and honor and our pleasure to have you. I just can't thank you enough, Jim. You just do so much for us. I mean, it really shows the bonds of friendship that we have between Australia and the United States. We are good friends. We have been for a very long time. We've hosted General MacArthur here, and I think it was close to a million American troops came and went through Australia during that period. And I think this just flows onto us. So we're closer than that. We're family in many respects. We're fellow democracies, and we're all fighting for the same thing, and that's freedom. And so for you to come on and address us is a real great honor, and we much appreciate that. And if I could ask the members that are on today, right now, just to hold up their hands and give Captain Fanell a cheer and a clap, and and thank you.
Well, it's been my honor, very much honored that you all would ask me, and I apologize again for going long. James was right, I was going to go too long, but if you have questions, you want to submit them in writing, I'll try to get back to you in emails if that's okay. But I really am honored that you would all ask me, especially since this announcement's so fresh, and you all are, trying to get this deal sealed and to move forward in your own defense. It's really important.
You're on mute, Chris.
Yes, if I may jump in, Captain Fanell, one of your slides was very, very important, and that was the one showing the 3 timeline steps we should take. I would be very grateful if that slide especially was circulated to everybody on this call, even if the others are not. That's the sort of message that we really need to hear, and you of all people are so well placed and experienced to provide that sort of advice. So that was very important.
I'm happy to circulate that if you're okay with that, Captain Fanell. Yep, great.
Well, Jim, are you okay for us to perhaps give everybody here access to that whole PDF presentation?
Yeah, certainly. I would be honored.
Oh, thank you. Well, we'll do that, and Chris, I've got it, so I can also flick it to you via email.
Yeah, the particular slide I'm mentioning though is worthy of much wider circulation. I think it's the sort of thing that you could forward to a lot of people in Canberra, for example.
Yeah, I know the one you're talking about. Slide 27. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, and just everybody, this has been recorded, and we'll put it up onto our branch YouTube page. And so, and we'd be happy to give access to anybody in the Australian government and the Australian Department of Defence access to watch this presentation. Be no problem at all.
Yep.
All right. Well, I think we'll sign off and say thank you very much, everybody, for coming on, and enjoy your evening. And thank you to Captain Fanell in landlocked Switzerland.
You're rubbing it in. Thanks. I miss the ocean.
We can't wait to have you down here, Jim, and you can be surfing at Manly right behind me.
Awesome.
Would be nice.
I got my boards now. They're in the backyard, so I finally got them after 6 years in storage. So I can fly. If they let you fly with boards, I'll bring one.
Well, I have a board, and Fred's got about 100 of them. So I think between the two of us, and James also. James is a surfer.
Excellent.
So we got you covered.
All right. Well, thanks, gentlemen. Have a great
evening. Thank you. Yeah, appreciate it.
Aloha.